The Thompson family always gathered at Grandma Edith's house for Thanksgiving. It had been that way for as long as anyone could remember. The house, an old Victorian, perched on a hill at the edge of town, had a history that stretched back nearly a century. The creaky floors, the dusty furniture, the faded portraits on the walls. It all held the weight of generations past. But it wasn't just the house that made Thanksgiving special. It was Grandma Edith herself, the heart of the family. This year, however, felt different. There was an unusual chill in the air, a heaviness that hung over the table, making the usual joy of the holiday seem hollow. Even the crackling fire in the hearth couldn't chase it away. Grandma Edith was quieter than usual. Her once sharp eyes, which had always sparkled with warmth and wit, were cloudy, distant, as the family sat around the table, the steam rising from the bowls of turkey and mashed potatoes. She simply stared into the fire, murmuring to herself, "Grandma, are you all right?" Her granddaughter, Emily, asked hesitantly, sitting beside her. Grandma Edith blinked, as though coming out of a trance. "Oh, yes, dear," she said with a forced smile. "Just thinking about the old days when we used to pray before the meal." Her voice trailed off, and she looked down at her hands, clasped tightly together in her lap. Emily glanced around the table. Her parents, aunts, uncles, all seemed to notice the change in the air, but were too polite, or perhaps too uncomfortable, to mention it. They knew Grandma Edith had been growing more forgetful lately, but there was something about her today that felt off. "Well, it's about time we said grace," Emily's father, David, said, clearing his throat. He motioned for everyone to join hands. As the family gathered together, their hands cold and stiff in each other's grips, Grandma Edith slowly raised her head. Her voice, when she spoke, was low, almost a whisper. The room fell silent, the sound of the fire crackling the only noise. "Lord," she began, her voice steady, but somehow wrong, too steady, as though it had been rehearsed. "We thank you for this meal, for the bounty you have provided, for the hands that prepared it, and for the hands that shall prepare it." She paused, her eyes flickering briefly toward the darkened corner of the room, where no one was standing. David glanced at his wife, confused. "Mom, is everything all right?" he asked, his voice nervous now. Grandma Edith ignored him and continued, her voice growing more fervent. "We thank you for the harvest of souls, for the warmth that fills this house, and for the hunger that brings us together, for the family, and for the one who will join us tonight and forevermore." The words hung heavy in the air, and the flames in the hearth flickered violently, as if reacting to her words. The family looked at each other, uncomfortable. Emily shifted uneasily in her seat, her grip on her mother's hand tightening. "Mom?" "Stop," David said, his voice shaking now. "This isn't funny. This isn't how we pray. What's going on?" But Grandma Edith didn't seem to hear him. Her eyes were wide, unfocused, her lips curled into a strange smile. "The feast has been prepared. The table is set. All are welcome, even those who were once lost." Suddenly, the room grew colder. A heavy weight seemed to press down on them, and the air was thick, suffocating. David felt a chill run up his spine, and his eyes flicked toward the front door, half expecting someone or something to be standing there. But no one was. Grandma Edith's voice grew louder, almost chanting now. We give thanks for the feast. We give thanks for the feast of what has been taken, and what shall be taken again. Then there was a sound, a faint scratching, as though something was clawing at the window. It was so soft, so subtle, that no one could quite place it, but the longer it persisted, the more unsettling it became. Emily stood abruptly, her chair scraping across the floor. I don't feel good," she said, her voice trembling. "I need some air." Before anyone could stop her, she bolted from the room, heading for the door. But just as she reached the threshold, the air seemed to grow thick, and the door wouldn't open. The handle twisted in her hand, but it wouldn't budge. She screamed, pulling harder, but it was as if the door had been sealed shut from the other side. Inside, the family continued to sit, frozen. Grandma Edith's voice now echoed through the house, rhythmic and hypnotic, as though she were speaking in some forgotten tongue. Her hands were raised high above her head, as if she were summoning something. And then, from the corner of the room, something moved. A figure, dark and hunched, slowly emerged from the shadows. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs twisting in unnatural angles as it slithered forward. The air around it seemed to warp, and its face was obscured by shadows, but Emily could feel its eyes, cold, empty, watching her. The scratching noise, too, was growing louder, as if the walls themselves were groaning under some unseen weight. "Mom! Dad!" Emily whispered in a panic, her hands pounding on the door, her voice barely audible. "Please, open the door." But the family remained in their seats, unmoving. Their eyes were glazed over, their hands still clasped in prayer. And at the table, beneath the dim light, there was a shadow, long and distorted, as though it had been cast from something not of this world. Emily took a step back, but she could not tear her eyes away from the table. Her stomach lurched, and for a moment, she could almost smell the stench of rotting meat. Something was waiting there, something she didn't want to face, but something that had been calling her all along. And then, the whispered words from Grandma Edith's prayer came back to her. And for those who have forgotten their place at the table, in that moment, Emily realized with terrible clarity, she was the feast. It was a tradition in the Miller family to host Thanksgiving at the old farmhouse nestled in the rolling hills just outside of town. For as long as anyone could remember, the house had been passed down through generations, its creaky wooden floors and heavy oak beams steeped in history. This year, as always, the long dining table was set with fine china, the crystal goblets sparkling under the warm glow of the chandelier, and the smell of roasted turkey and freshly baked pies filled the air. But this Thanksgiving, something was different. Lena Miller stood in the kitchen, her hands shaking slightly as she arranged the food on the table. Her mother, Martha, was beside her, humming softly as she added the final touches to the mashed potatoes. Everything was perfect, too perfect. The turkey was golden brown and juicy. The stuffing had just the right balance of herbs, and the pumpkin pie was already cooling on the windowsill. Still, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The house felt empty. Her father, William, had been acting strangely for weeks. He'd grown quieter, more withdrawn, his eyes constantly darting toward the shadows of the house, as though something were watching him. And her brother, Greg, hadn't been himself either. He'd come back home late the night before, looking pale and disheveled, as though he hadn't slept in days. He hadn't said a word since. "Mom," Lena said, glancing over at her mother, "do you think everything is all right this year? I mean, don't you think we've been feeling a little off lately?" Martha stopped humming and gave Lena a long, curious look. "Oh, sweetheart, it's just the stress of the season. You know how your father gets." She smiled, but it was thin, forced. "Nothing to worry about. We're going to have a wonderful Thanksgiving, just like always." But Lena wasn't so sure. There was a strange tension in the air, an unease that seemed to cling to the very walls of the farmhouse, as if the house itself were holding its breath. The guests started arriving around 4 p.m. Uncle Ray and Aunt Linda came first, then cousins Jason and Emily, who were always more excited about the dessert than the actual meal. The chatter around the house was warm and familiar, and for a while, the unease that had plagued Lena's thoughts seemed to dissipate. Her father, William, was in the living room, sipping whiskey and telling stories to the guests, but his face was drawn, his movements slow and stiff. It was as though he was here, but not here, all at once. The family finally gathered around the table. The candles flickered in the dim light, casting long shadows that stretched across the room, like fingers reaching out. Everyone took their seats, murmuring their thanks, but there was a noticeable silence. No one spoke too much, as if they were all waiting for something to happen. Lena sat next to her brother, Greg, who hadn't said a word all evening. His eyes were sunken, his skin pale, and his hands trembled as he reached for his glass of wine. His fingers brushed against hers, cold as ice. "You okay?" Lena whispered, her voice barely audible over the clinking of silverware. Greg didn't respond at first. Then, slowly, he turned to her, his eyes wide and distant. I didn't want to come here tonight," he said quietly, his voice strained. "I didn't want to eat with them. Not after what we did. What they made me do." Lena frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" Greg swallowed hard, his throat tightening as though he couldn't speak the words. But he didn't have to. The air around them suddenly felt heavier, as if the room had dropped several degrees in temperature. The low hum of conversation around the table faded, and Lena noticed her father's gaze had shifted to her, his eyes dark, hollow, his expression unreadable. "Greg, what's wrong?" Lena pressed, her voice growing louder now. Greg opened his mouth, as though trying to speak, but no sound came out. His eyes darted toward the door, and suddenly, the room fell completely silent. It was then that Lena realized what had changed. The food on the table was no longer just food. There was something wrong about it. The turkey's skin had a strange, unnatural sheen, and the mashed potatoes seemed too white, almost too perfect, as if they were molded from something other than food. The cranberry sauce, thick and glistening, had a deep, almost too red hue, and there was something pulsing beneath it. She recoiled, her stomach turning. "I don't want to eat this," she said, her voice trembling. But her father, William, was already standing, his hands clapping together sharply. "Let us pray," he said, his voice low and deep, his tone far too formal for the occasion. There was something in the way he said it that made Lena's blood run cold. The family members around the table bowed their heads, but Lena remained frozen in her chair, staring at the grotesque feast before her. Her eyes flickered to Greg, whose face had gone even more ashen, his lips moving in silent prayer. He looked as though he were about to cry. "Mom? What's happening?" Lena whispered, but her mother didn't respond. Instead, Martha, with a blank expression, raised her head and began to speak, her voice hollow, as though it wasn't really hers at all. "We give thanks for what we have. We give thanks for what we shall receive." Lena felt a cold sweat break out across her forehead. What was going on? Why did her mother sound so empty? Her stomach churned in protest, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the scene unfolding before her. "We give thanks," Martha continued, "for those who have come to share the meal, for those who have brought life, and for those who will return to us." Lena felt the weight of her mother's words like a suffocating force. The meal was not a gift. It was an offering, and they had all been drawn into it, trapped by some ancient and horrible custom. Her father's voice joined in, joining with Martha's in an eerie, unified chant. "We give thanks to those who have been reborn." Suddenly, the door creaked open. Lena's eyes darted toward it. A figure stood there in the threshold, silhouetted by the dim light from the hallway. It was tall, unnaturally thin, and as it stepped into the room, Lena saw that its face was obscured by shadows. The only thing visible were its eyes, wide, unblinking, dead. "We give thanks," the figure whispered, its voice a rasping, breathless sound, "for those who have been reborn, and for the one who has come back to join us." Lena's blood ran cold as the figure moved toward the table, its footsteps soundless on the wooden floor. It was then that she saw it, the body. The turkey on the table, once golden brown, now seemed to shimmer with a dark liquid. As she stared, she saw the truth. The meat was no longer meat at all. It was flesh. Her father's hand reached out, steady and deliberate, and he began carving the flesh with the same precision of a butcher preparing a sacrifice. "It's time," he whispered, his voice now thick with something unnatural. "Time to share the meal." Lena's heart pounded in her chest as the figure moved toward her. She tried to scream, to run, but her body felt paralyzed, frozen in place. And then, before her eyes, her father placed a thick slice of the flesh onto her plate. "We give thanks," he said, his eyes glinting with something dark, "for those who have come to join us. Welcome home, Lena." The truth hit her in a wave of horror. The feast was not for celebration. It was for something far more sinister, and she was the main course. It was a crisp Thanksgiving evening in the small town of Hollow Creek, where the locals had gathered for the annual feast. The town was known for its old traditions. Each year, families would share a meal, tell stories, and reflect on their blessings. But this year, something felt off. It began with the mysterious disappearance of Ruth Madison, an elderly woman who had never missed a Thanksgiving dinner. She lived alone in a dilapidated farmhouse at the edge of town, whispered about, but rarely visited. When the dinner bell rang, Ruth was nowhere to be found. She must have gotten lost, someone suggested, but no one really believed that. The route was familiar, and Ruth always found her way. Hours passed, and the meal continued without her. The turkey was carved, the mashed potatoes served, but an uneasy tension hung in the air. As midnight approached, the guests, half drunk from wine and pies, were startled by a loud crack from the hallway. Sheriff Tom Harris stood up, his face pale. "What the hell was that?" he muttered, his voice trembling. Then came the sound again, a series of rhythmic thuds, followed by a dragging noise. The room went silent as the door creaked open. Ruth Madison stood in the doorway. She was different. Her clothes torn, hair matted with dark clumps, eyes wide and staring, and the smell, the overwhelming scent of earth and decay. "Ruth," Sheriff Harris whispered, taking a cautious step forward. Ruth tilted her head, a grimace on her face. They're hungry," she rasped. Her movements were jerky and unnatural, and her hands were covered in dirt. She staggered toward the table, crawling onto it, tearing into the turkey with her bare hands. The guests recoiled, horrified, as she devoured it like a wild animal. "Step away from the table, Ruth," Sheriff Harris shouted, pulling his gun. But Ruth didn't respond. Instead, the floor began to tremble. Then, from the shadows, figures began to emerge. Pale, gaunt figures with hollow eyes and stretched skin. They moved like Ruth, unnaturally jerking forward. "They're coming," Ruth mumbled, blood dripping from her chin. "Every year, for the harvest." The air grew cold as the figures advanced, and the guests realized too late. They weren't just celebrating Thanksgiving. They were part of an ancient ritual. As the townspeople fled, they heard the chilling cries of those who stayed behind. By morning, the town was empty, save for Ruth and the others who would feast on the living, continuing the cycle of hunger and death that had plagued Hollow Creek for generations. And every year, the harvest would return. But this time, the nightmares would come for anyone who dared to sit at the table